How does a courtroom, a place meant to uphold justice, become a battlefield for arrogance and corruption? What happens when those who are supposed to enforce the law instead use their power to silence the truth? Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett knew exactly what she was up against when she walked into the courtroom that day, but even she did not anticipate just how deep the corruption ran. Judge Howard Gates had a reputation. He was known not just for his stern rulings, but for the way he handled cases involving the rich and powerful. Time and time again, accusations had surfaced about his questionable decisions, yet no one had been able to hold him accountable. That was about to change. Jasmine Crockett stood before the court, presenting evidence in a high-profile corruption case against a wealthy developer whose influence stretched far beyond what most people could imagine. She had spent months gathering documents, speaking to witnesses, and uncovering financial transactions that revealed a disturbing pattern of bribery and manipulation. But Judge Gates, seated above her with a glare of thinly veiled contempt, was not interested in justice. His dismissive tone, the condescending remarks, the way he waved away crucial pieces of evidence, it was all designed to undermine her credibility, to make her look unprepared, as if her case was built on nothing but speculation. Every time she presented a document, he found a reason to discount it. When she introduced a key witness, he interrupted with objections that favored the defense. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with the unspoken reality that this was not a fair trial. The developer's legal team smirked, knowing they had the judge on their side. It was a game to them, a performance in which the outcome had already been decided long before the first word was spoken. But Jasmine Crockett was not one to be intimidated. She had faced worse, and she was not about to let this judge dictate the terms of justice. Then came the moment that shifted everything. As she laid out the financial records, detailing a series of illegal transactions, she noticed something: a signature at the bottom of one of the documents, a signature that did not belong to the developer or his associates. It was Judge Howard Gates's name, right there, linked to an unauthorized financial transaction that directly benefited the very man he was protecting. A hush fell over the courtroom. The defense team stiffened, suddenly less confident. The judge, for the first time, looked uneasy, but rather than address the damning evidence, he doubled down. His voice rose, his words sharp and laced with outrage. He called the evidence inadmissible, claimed it was irrelevant, even threatened Jasmine with sanctions for presenting it. It was a desperate attempt to maintain control, to keep the truth buried beneath legal technicalities. But the harder he pushed, the more obvious it became that he was scrambling to protect himself. The crowd murmured, journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and the members of the jury exchanged glances. They could see what was happening. They could see the cracks forming in the judge's authority. Jasmine remained composed, her expression unreadable, but inside, she knew she had struck a nerve. She was close, closer than she had ever been to exposing something far bigger than just one corrupt developer. Judge Gates had been caught off guard, but he was not finished yet. He still had power, still had influence, and he was willing to use every ounce of it to stop her from going any further. But Jasmine had more than just documents. She had something no one could deny, something that would bring this courtroom to a standstill. Would the judge find a way to suppress the truth before it was too late? Or was this the moment when his entire career, his carefully constructed web of control, would come crashing down? Judge Howard Gates was fighting to regain control, but the damage had already been done. The weight of Jasmine Crockett's evidence hung over the courtroom like a dark cloud, impossible to ignore. He could dismiss documents. He could discredit witnesses. But there was one thing he could not erase: the undeniable proof of his own name, signed in a place it had no right to be. Yet instead of addressing the revelation with logic or reason, he lashed out. His voice carried across the courtroom, his words filled with indignation, as he accused Jasmine of presenting fraudulent evidence, of twisting facts to serve her own agenda. The audience shifted uncomfortably. The once confident defense team now looked uneasy, as if they could sense the unraveling of a carefully orchestrated plan. Jasmine remained still, her eyes locked on the judge. She had seen this before. The way corrupt men panicked when their power was threatened. It was never about disproving the accusations. It was about making as much noise as possible to drown out the truth. But this was a courtroom, and theatrics would only get him so far. Then, with the calm precision of someone who had prepared for every possible reaction, Jasmine reached into her case and pulled out something that would leave the entire courtroom in stunned silence: a recording. The murmurs in the room grew louder as she held up the device. The judge's face, once red with fury, paled slightly. He knew. He did not know what was on it, but he knew it could not be good. Without waiting for his approval, Jasmine played the recording. The room went still as the voice crackled through the speakers. It was unmistakable. The deep, authoritative tone of Judge Howard Gates himself. The arrogance in his words was impossible to miss. He was discussing the very case in question, but not as an impartial judge. No, his words revealed something far more sinister. He spoke about ensuring the case never made it to a fair verdict, about finding legal loopholes to dismiss crucial evidence, about ensuring the wealthy developer walked free, no matter what Jasmine presented. But then came the moment that turned the air ice cold. He laughed. He laughed as he admitted to bending the law, to using his position to shield the powerful from consequences. It was not justice. It was corruption laid bare. Gasps rippled through the room. Journalists frantically jotted down notes, their eyes wide with disbelief. The jury members sat frozen, their expressions shifting from confusion to disgust. Even the defense team, who had spent the entire trial smirking with confidence, had lost all color in their faces. Judge Gates slammed his gavel down, demanding silence, demanding that the recording be stopped. But the truth was already out. His voice, his own words, were now evidence against him. He could deny documents, he could dismiss testimony, but he could not erase what everyone had just heard. His grip on the courtroom, on the case, on his own carefully built reputation, was slipping through his fingers. Still, he refused to back down. He called the recording inadmissible, claimed it was illegally obtained, that it was manipulated, fabricated. His words came out in rapid succession, desperate, panicked. But no one was listening. The courtroom was no longer under his control. His once commanding presence had been reduced to a man desperately trying to cover his tracks, and it was painfully obvious to everyone watching. Jasmine knew she had him, but she was not done yet. She had more to reveal, more to ensure that this man would not walk away from his crimes with nothing more than a tarnished reputation. She turned to the jury, to the audience, to the journalists who would carry this story beyond the walls of the courtroom. There was still one more piece of the puzzle left to expose, one final move that would leave Judge Gates with no escape. Would he try to shut down the trial completely? Would his connections in the legal system come rushing to his aid, trying to protect him from the consequences of his actions? Or was this the moment when even those who once stood by him would turn their backs, realizing he was no longer worth protecting? Judge Howard Gates had spent years operating with impunity, ruling over cases with an iron fist, knowing that his word carried more weight than evidence, more power than truth. But now, for the first time, that power was slipping. The recording had shattered the illusion of his authority, exposing him as a man willing to bend justice for his own benefit. The courtroom was no longer under his control. The weight of the revelation pressed down on the air, making it heavy, suffocating. He tried to recover, tried to shift the focus, but no one was looking at him the same way anymore. Jasmine Crockett stood unwavering, her presence alone enough to keep him cornered. She had anticipated his reaction, the denial, the accusations, but she was ready for it all. She reached into her case once more, pulling out yet another damning piece of evidence. The room held its breath as she placed a stack of documents onto the table, bank records, signed authorizations, and financial transfers that left no room for interpretation. These were not just any transactions. These were payments, discreet but traceable, linking Judge Gates directly to the developer's legal team. The final thread was being pulled, unraveling everything. The very man who was supposed to uphold the law had been bought. He had turned his courtroom into a marketplace, where justice was determined not by the strength of an argument, but by the weight of a bribe. His once commanding voice faltered as he struggled to explain away the evidence. He pointed fingers, accused Jasmine of manufacturing lies, of orchestrating a conspiracy against him. But the more he spoke, the more desperate he sounded. The jury members looked at one another, their faces shifting from shock to certainty. The journalists could hardly write fast enough, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. This was bigger than just one case. This was a moment that would ripple through the entire justice system, a moment that could not be ignored or swept aside. Still, Judge Gates clung to his position, refusing to accept the inevitable. His gavel slammed against the wood, his voice rising with the same authority he had always used to silence opposition. But this time, the gavel did not bring order. It did not command respect. It was the sound of a man trying, failing, to hold on to power that no longer belonged to him. Jasmine remained silent, letting the weight of the evidence speak for itself. There was nothing left to argue. The documents, the recording, the undeniable. Truth had already done what no amount of courtroom theatrics could undo. The people in the gallery whispered amongst themselves, a mixture of disbelief and quiet satisfaction. The man who had sat in judgment of so many was now the one under scrutiny. And then, the inevitable happened. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and several officers stepped inside. A hush fell over the room, an almost eerie silence as the realization settled in. The law was finally coming for the judge himself. Would he attempt one last desperate move? Would he finally accept the consequences of his own actions? Or would he go down fighting, unwilling to face the reality of what he had become? Judge Howard Gates had ruled over countless cases, passing judgment on those who stood before him. But now, the roles had reversed. The officers moving toward him were not there to restore order in his courtroom. They were there for him. The weight of the moment pressed down on every spectator, every juror, every journalist who had witnessed the collapse of his authority. The man who had once commanded respect through sheer intimidation now looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between the walls of his own courtroom as if searching for an escape. But there was none. Still, his pride would not let him surrender easily. His voice, though laced with panic, rang out in one final attempt to regain control. He declared the trial null and void, claimed that Jasmine Crockett had manipulated the proceedings, that her evidence was inadmissible, that this was nothing more than a political takedown. But no one was listening. His words, once feared, now fell on deaf ears. Jasmine stood motionless, watching as the weight of justice finally bore down on him. She had not needed to raise her voice, had not needed to argue against his accusations. The truth had done all the work. The officers moved closer, their presence an undeniable reminder that the law was not something he could control anymore. For a moment, he refused to move. He stood behind his bench, gripping the edge with white-knuckled hands, his face shifting from rage to disbelief. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, but the cold realization was finally setting in. His reign was over. Then, in one last, humiliating display, he turned to the officers, demanding to know who had authorized his arrest, insisting that they were making a grave mistake. But the silence that followed told him everything. The law, the very thing he had twisted to his advantage for so long, was now enforcing its will upon him. As the officers reached for him, he flinched. It was not the touch of their hands that broke him. It was the finality of it all. He was no longer the judge, no longer the most powerful man in the room. He was simply another defendant, another man answering for his crimes. The courtroom, filled with people who had once feared his wrath, now watched with quiet satisfaction as justice took its course. Jasmine did not smirk, did not gloat. She did not need to. This was not about personal victory. It was about exposing corruption, about ensuring that no man, no matter how powerful, was above the law. As Judge Howard Gates was led out of the courtroom, the silence was broken by the sound of cameras flashing, reporters scrambling to document every second of his downfall. The once mighty judge was now just another headline, another cautionary tale. But Jasmine knew this was just the beginning. There were still others who had enabled him, others who had benefited from the corruption he had protected. This was not the end of the fight. It was only the first domino to fall, and as she gathered her case files preparing for the next battle, one thing was certain: justice had only just begun.